Hello. How's it going, everyone? Hope you're well. Got some new ideas. Sorry, I'm trying to casually start this and not make it awkward. I'm going to be responding to some pushback that I received on the last video that I made. In the comments on Patreon, I had a few different people pushing back on a number of different ideas. And for a couple of them, I was able to respond in the comments there on Patreon. But the first person who gave me some pushback, which I seriously really appreciate, I've actually been, I was really hoping to maybe get some pushback. So I was really thankful for his comment. I think maybe that even sparked some of the others. I'm not going to name him probably throughout this video, but we're going to read his comments here, his response. He had two separate comments rather. And then we're going to dive into it. We're going to look at it. So let me just start by reading them out and then we can proceed. Okay. All right. This person says, I remember you saying in some old video or podcast that you try to eliminate everything from your life that feels like a weakness. Don't remember the context also, and maybe I'm misremembering, but I see strong dependence on a strict religion as a possible weakness, as it could mean one is not capable of forming their own set of morals and rules to live by. Also, I don't think the point you made of if someone believes in the fact that every human has the same worth, it is likely because they were raised in a Christian country, which was my claim. That's the claim that this person's rebutting and that we're going to discuss. He continues and says, the Western world has been predominantly Christian for multiple centuries, while seeing the same worth in every human has been a concept that has been tried to be implemented in a society more and more in the last 70 years maybe. And people have been getting less and less religious in these 70 years. Back when pretty much everyone was a devoted Christian, the worth of humans was vastly different depending on their social status, gender, or title. Women's opinions/ideas were ignored or at least valued less. Skin color mattered immensely, so on. All of this still is true today to some degree, obviously, but I believe way less than 100 or 200 years ago. So my point is, I guess I don't think the belief in human worth has anything to do with Christianity / can't be ascribed to the countries we grew up in being predominantly Christian. Liked what you said about self-worth. Interesting thoughts. Lots of love. I responded basically just saying thank you for the pushback and that I'm going to try and dive into this later. But he sent another message that we will get to at some point, so I'll just read it now. He says, the story of Cain and Abel has been appearing in some books I have been reading, so it's been in the back of my mind. And I think looking at it through the lens of worth in every human being, one could interpret it something like this. Cain and Abel both give offerings to God. They give what they have got. They give different things because they have different jobs. God favors Abel's offering, but he doesn't see the same worth in the offerings. This leads to Cain killing Abel. But the starting point of Cain's anger / sin comes from his offerings being seen as less. His offerings, or put differently, him being seen as less. His life's work, his effort as a human being, seen as less valuable than Abel's. His offering, and therefore his soul, being rejected. So my interpretation in the context would be Cain's sin originates from being seen as worth less by God. So I would put the fault of the killing of Abel at least partly in God's hand for putting different worth in the two brothers. Just came to me as an example of how equal human worth is not a principle enforced or held up that high in my experiences with Christianity. Would be interested if you see the point I'm trying to make or if I lost the plot completely in your eyes. Then he adds, also the light in my room started flickering while I wrote this, which that is pretty funny. Okay. All right. So those are the comments. That's what we're going to try and dig into today. Again, thank you for the pushback. Seriously, I really appreciate it. I'm going to be, debating or arguing a little bit throughout this video, but it's all love. And again, really, really appreciate this. So I want to get to your response point by point. and address everything you said. But first, I want to try and present a fundamental idea, I guess. I don't know, a concept that I think is important to this conversation. I think there's a few misunderstandings going on, and I'm not saying that this person is the source of this misunderstanding. It's probably my fault if there is a misunderstanding. Either way, I just want to set proper boundaries around this topic so we know what we're talking about when we talk about Christianity and what it is, and how that differs from talking about Christianity's effect on society, which I think deserves a pretty healthy degree of distinction. I'm hoping I can illustrate why that is. Also, I'm just presenting this idea first because I think it's going to weave in and out as we go, and it also reveals something very important about what we're talking about. Okay, this idea is that the Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform. You can also word that, you could word it in a number of different ways, but you could word it as Christ's main concern, his priority is to heal the human heart, not to heal human civilizations. Okay, now I'm not saying any of that because I'm backing down from my previous claims. I did make a claim about Christianity affecting society, specifically Western society, to which this person responded to. Again, they said, I don't think the belief in human worth has anything to do with Christianity / can't be ascribed to the countries we grew up in being predominantly Christian. Giving a thorough response to this claim, from my perspective, is what this video's about. I'm just kind of prefacing because we're wandering a bit out of the bounds of discussing Christ himself or Christianity proper. And I don't know if this is true, but I have on my mind the idea that someone may be watching this video because they want to hear about Christianity, maybe even for the first time. So I feel a little guilty to talk so much about the good Christianity has done, or to argue whether it's done any good at all, as if that's supposed to convince you or help you in some kind of spiritual way, because I don't think that's true. Okay, and it's my fault probably anyways for saying such a provocative comment in my last video. It was probably just unnecessary. But I think it's still worth talking about. I'm thinking that this is still worth getting into because it's likely an unexplored topic for many people, or if anything, maybe a diluted one. You don't look at another person, or I hope you don't look at another person who's different than you are, or you don't look at a person of lesser financial or social status and ever think they're less of a person. And that's most likely because you were raised in a society shaped by Christians or Christian values, whether you like it or not, because that was not always the majority thought in the ancient world. So again, one more time, I appreciate the pushback. If you're out there and you're watching this, I have lots of love for you. You're not the only person either who pressed me on the comments I made. So I'm really glad to dive deeper into this, and I probably should. I think the other comment I received accused me of sounding like a Christian supremacist, which is a little harsh, but I can take it. And that develops into a really good conversation as well. So I was happy for that pushback too. Okay, that being said, it does seem like the claim I made is maybe something that rubbed some people the wrong way, or it just didn't sound accurate to their understanding of history, which I want to say I completely understand. I think history eludes us all today, especially Christian history. And even I just learned a few new things myself in preparation for this. I learned some new things. However, I gotta say, after the bit of research I just did, I am about to confidently double down on my previous claim and say Christianity did not simply influence Western ideas of human worth. I think, whether you like it or not, Christianity defined it. All right, I'm coming out swinging. Okay, let's get into it. I hope everyone has some fun here. We're just talking ideas, right? Just ideas. I'll always welcome more pushback. I could be wrong about some things as we go along, but I have really done my best to fact check myself and make sure that the information I'm about to provide is responsible. But Yeah. One of my main reasons, main reasons I wanted to start publicly speaking about this stuff is so I could engage with people who disagree with me. Personally, I really enjoy having my ideas like pushed or tested, or learning new ways that I'm totally wrong. I've found it's one of the best ways to motivate me to learn more, and I find that fun. So we're just having fun here. Okay. I'm going to respond to your comment about religion being a weakness, hopefully at the end of the video. That one's a little more philosophical in nature. So before we start out with me getting all into the weeds of my thoughts and opinions, let's just save that for the end and dig into some history to start out. Okay, let's look at his comment again. He wrote, "The Western world has been predominantly Christian for multiple centuries, while seeing the same worth in every human has been tried to be implemented only in the last 70 years. I would start by saying I think this framing is misleading because it relies on a very short historical window. What I want to try and do today is widen this window. Hopefully for you, maybe for others listening. Okay. To be fair, I do think this is the timeline most people think of when they think of Christian history or Christianity in the West, right? It looks something like this, as this person described. We have an idea of the past few centuries, maybe 2 or 3, could be a faint idea of the past 5. We know people say the West was more Christian back then, but not as much these days. We have an idea that bad stuff was going on back then, right? Immediately, we could think of slavery. I'm sure everyone thinks of that. And maybe colonialism. Maybe you're thinking about the oppression of gay people or how women are being mistreated. And behind all of it are people claiming to be Christians. Then we have, as this person described, right around the decline of Christianity, suddenly, for the first time, things are finally getting better. Now, if this is our window of history that we base our conclusions off of, I think the places or the opinions or the conclusions, where this person lands could make sense, right? I can get with it logically, but let's zoom out and try to get a better picture of what's going on here. What does the West even mean? That's a good question, right? Where did that term come from? Is there more to the history of Christianity? When did that even start? Let's look into it. Okay. Hope you guys are with me so far. All right. If we go all the way back to when Christianity first emerges on the scene, roughly 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus was killed by Roman crucifixion. Forget all that's disputed about it. Let's stick to the universal, historically agreed upon facts that we know is true. A man named Jesus was crucified by the Romans. And this seemed to put an end to the religious movement this man Jesus had started during the last years of his life. But sometime after his death, his followers claimed he rose from the dead and Christianity was reignited and began to spread. It was illegal for a long time to be Christian. Many of the people who followed Jesus and claimed to see him risen from the dead were actually tortured and killed because they would not deny what they'd seen. This we also know is true and is historically confirmed by many non-Christian sources outside of the Bible from antiquity. Persecution didn't end with them. Starting in 64 AD, Emperor Nero of Rome began killing Christians in all sorts of ways. They were crucified, thrown into dens of wild animals to be torn apart by lions and such. And it's recorded, most infamous of Nero's methods, that captured Christians were covered in tar and burned alive to light up Emperor Nero's garden at night. This persecution went on for a few hundred years in different forms. Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century saw to Christian persecution that is widely regarded as the worst in Roman history, even worse than Nero. Despite all this persecution, Christianity continued to spread. It spread so much that by 380 AD, under Theodosius, Christianity somehow becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So at this point, not only the West, but the entire Roman Empire, the East and the West, is considered Christian. In 395 AD, the Roman Empire officially splits. There was a previous governmental split, I believe under Diocletian, but now it officially splits, and we get this distinction of the East and the West. Both remained Christian empires, and though there was now a government split, the Christian church as a whole across the East and the West was still united. But we do have here our first look at the West, or the Western world, which referred to the Western Roman Empire, which was a Christian empire from the very beginning of it receiving this Western distinction. In 476 AD, the Roman Empire of the West collapses. The centralized Roman authority is no more, and German kingdoms replace Roman rule while the Roman Empire in the East remains. Now, even though the Western Empire has collapsed, the distinction of the West, or the Western world, never went away. And why is that? Because they were still united culturally by Christianity, or the church. This is what they called Christendom, a network of Christian kingdoms united by Latin Christianity. Now, while the East may not have used the word Christendom, that's simply because they didn't speak Latin. They did, however, consider themselves a Christian Roman Empire. From what I've learned, to be Roman then was to be Christian. To them, the empire existed to uphold Christianity, and the emperor was considered God's servant protecting orthodoxy. At this point in time, Christianity itself was not separated by East and West, but actually remained united. Both the Empire of the East and the kingdoms of the West considered themselves under the same church authority. Now, in 1054, the church did split between the East and the West. This is the Great Schism, leaving the Latin Christian West and the Greek Christian East, what we'd call the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, after this split, there's even more of a distinction of what the West refers to. Not only the two halves of the Christian empire divided by borders, but also the two halves of the church itself divided by theology and church authority. That all being said, to say the West has been predominantly or mostly Christian for multiple centuries, I'd argue is not only a misleading explanation of the timeline, but also misleading to consider Christianity as if it was a layer added upon the West, rather than understanding Christianity is what formed the West. Let's fill in a few more gaps on this timeline while we're here for people unfamiliar with the influence Christianity in the West has had on our lives today. Shortly after the Great Schism, out of the church in the West, we get the modern university. That's right. Institutionalized higher education, as we know it today, is a product of the Christian church. They believed a pursuit of higher knowledge about the world was a pursuit of God and therefore a form of worship. Two of the first universities formed are still around today. The University of Bologna in Italy was formed in 1088 AD, and the University of Oxford, shout out to Oxford, formed in 1096. In the US, every Ivy League school we think of today was founded by Christians for the main purpose of training ministers. By the 12th century, the church has now produced the innovation of classical music. It emerges first as a sacred worship to God, not as a secular art. The church invents musical notation for the purpose of preserving worship music and ensuring it can be reproduced accurately in the future. The church also produces other musical systems such as harmony and large-scale compositions. Okay, what next? Well, over the next few centuries, the Christian West produced the system of modern science as we know it today. Of course, science and math itself existed before in many cultures, but what emerged uniquely in the Christian West was a sustained and institutional pursuit of science, one that didn't die out but kept building upon itself over time. This stemmed from specific Christian assumptions that God is rational and that the universe is intelligible because there is an intelligent creator behind all creation. It was the Christian belief that our existence was not random and therefore there was an order to the universe, and it was that assumption of order, the assumption that the natural world can be explained, that furthered the systematic exploration of it. While some people today think the scientific revolution in the West was a rejection of Christianity, it was actually a product of it. Studying nature wasn't seen as opposing God, it was seen as studying his work. What we can see very clearly is that ideas develop slowly over time throughout society. We just went over several contributions of the Western world, not simply because it was influenced by Christianity, but because Western ideas were defined by Christianity. Since the inception of the West, we can clearly see it's done great things in the world of higher education and art as well as science. But you might ask, since this is really what we're talking about, what about social injustice? How did Christian thought affect the development of social ideas throughout history? Well, maybe the most noteworthy in the centuries to follow, we see Christian thought producing the first mass movements to abolish slavery in all recorded human history, based firmly on Christian theological arguments about human worth, the main one being that all humans are created equal in the image of God. Wow. I'd say that is a pretty impressive accomplishment in the realm of social reform. What a great change Christianity provided. Now, before you get mad, I know to most people this sounds like a really strange and maybe sugar-coated way to convey Christianity and its relationship to slavery, especially if the window of history in which you view Christianity, or even the Western world, looks like this. I hope I've shown you already how much you can expand your understanding of reality by simply zooming out on your window of perceived history. If we look just at this window that we've gone over so far, it's worthwhile to note that the arguments against slavery in a Christian context did not arise for the first time here in the 18th century, but actually the earliest ever recorded arguments for abolishing slavery occurred here in the 300s. Again, grounded on Christian theology. We can look at Gregory of Nyssa, the exact same church father, might I add, that I quoted at the end of my last video. Gregory explicitly condemned slavery on moral and theological grounds. He did not simply argue for better treatment of them, but emphasized freeing slaves and criticized the social structures that allowed it to continue. He argued that all humans are created in the image of God, and therefore it is incompatible with God's law to treat one person as the property of another. I think this is worth noting because it didn't take until the 18th century, let's say, to come to this conclusion about slavery from a Christian moral framework. It just took that long to change the system at the state or legal level. Let's stay on the topic of slavery, which I'm pretty sure is the most extreme example of social inequality, and widen our window of history again. Let's look back at the beginning of recorded human history, which most historians place around 3300 BC. The first evidence we have of written history is cuneiform from Mesopotamia, which shows slavery is already well established at this point. So I think it's fair to infer human beings likely came up with slavery before they came up with the written language. If we zoom out again to the first archaeological evidence of human civilization, we have Göbekli Tepe, which is believed to date back as far as 9600 BC. Through archaeology, rather than written history, we can see more evidence for potential slavery, with possible mass forced labor projects such as this megalithic construction, as well as other ancient sites around the world. You could argue perhaps that Göbekli Tepe was a shared communal effort, which is a fair argument. No one really knows. But we also have skeletal remains in various sites throughout the ancient world, from the Levant between 9000 and 5000 BC, from Neolithic Anatolia between 8000 and 6000 BC, and Neolithic Europe between 5000 and 3000 BC. In studying these skeletal remains, archaeologists find evidence of repeated stress injuries, malnutrition since childhood, binding marks, and lower status burial practices, which most archaeologists conclude are signs of forced labor conditions. So, if we work off the assumption that slavery has existed, potentially, since the beginning of human civilizations, and we know that it did exist throughout time everywhere in the world. It was not a cultural issue. It was not a Jewish issue or a Roman issue or a Greek issue or an African issue or a Native American issue. It was a human issue. I would argue that this accomplishment of the Christian West, the first mass abolishment of slavery in all human history, grounded by Christian theology, is not just significant, but one of the greatest gifts Christian thought has provided our society today. And to clarify, I'm not saying Christians were morally perfect. It means the moral vocabulary used to end slavery came from Christianity, even when Christians themselves were inconsistent. So, in response to the pushback I received that our belief today in human worth has nothing to do with Christianity, and that seeing equal value in every human has only developed in the past 70 years due to the decline of Christianity, I would have to strongly disagree. And let's look closer at the claim made about the past 70 years. This person said, people have become less religious as equality has increased. I think what is missed in this claim is understanding how ideas actually develop over time. I think what this person is confusing is moral inheritance with moral origin. While the language for modern human rights may have developed in the past 70 years or so, it didn't arise in a vacuum. It was built upon thousands of years of theological assumptions about dignity, moral equality, and the value of the individual. People didn't suddenly discover human worth after Christianity declined. They inherited those assumptions from a Christian moral framework and then secularized them later. I think most people don't understand the importance of our assumptions. So many things that we think are discovered truths, like things that we really figured out on our own, they feel like they're our truths, right? They're our ideas, when really they're just ideas handed down to us from somewhere else. Without a full scope of history, I think it's possible to go on through life having no idea where we got our framework for reality. You may think you believe in equal human worth because it's obvious, but I'd urge you to try and humble yourself to the reality of all human history and consider if you were born in another time or even in another place, your assumptions might be different. I think it's also worth considering that by modern estimates outside of the West, there are more humans living in conditions classified as slavery on Earth today than at any time in previous recorded history. I think a lot of people are unaware of this. To me, that says the abolishment of slavery in the West, or you can pick another social reform related to human equality, that it wasn't just a product of natural human progressiveness over time. It wasn't because we became more secular. It wasn't because we became more advanced as a civilization. If any of that were true, why is there more slaves on Earth today in 2026 than ever before? What sent the West on a different trajectory? We can also look at a place like North Korea. I'm sure we're all familiar with the horrendous human injustices that have taken place there: mass starvation, forced labor, hereditary punishment, and so on. We might wonder, maybe some people have wondered, how does the leader of North Korea justify this treatment of his own people? I'm not trying to say this is the sole justification, but this is a convenient point for the case I was making in my last video. Don't you think it's odd that the exact framework of human worth in the ancient world that I described the Bible uniquely challenged, that the leader of a nation was divine, but the citizens were not, is the exact same framework held by North Korea? Just like the pharaohs in Egypt, the leader of North Korea is thought of like a god, while the people are not. Personally, I'd say that's more evidence of how a simple idea like all humans being made in the image of God, when that idea is made available to challenge the status quo, it can have immense effect in shaping a society's view on human equality. My argument was, and still is, that human equality is not a secular development. Time and time again, when we see societies that lack this idea, Even in highly advanced, highly secular nations, leaders become untouchable, people become expendable, and justice becomes arbitrary. If we look back at the comment I received, this person says, back when pretty much everyone was a devoted Christian, the worth of humans was vastly different depending on status, gender, or title. As I've been trying to say, that's true descriptively, but the cause is misidentified. People often suggest inequality stemmed from Christianity, but we all know inequality existed in every civilization before Christianity, right? Pagan Rome, ancient Greece, Egypt, China, India, tribal societies in the Americas. I could keep going, right? Slavery and caste systems and the patriarchy were all universal features of human civilizations since the beginning of recorded history, long before Christianity appeared. What we can observe about Christianity with certainty is that it did not invent inequality. Instead, I'd argue it introduced a moral framework that challenged it. Now, if we do want to make a fair critique on Christianity, I'd say the question isn't whether Christianity influenced Western ideas of human worth. I think the historical case for that is strong enough. Instead, a better question could be, why did some Christian ideas take so long to affect social and legal change? Well, that brings me back to the original point I was trying to make, and that the main priority of these ideas was to affect change in our hearts, not in our culture. Again, Christianity is not a guidebook for social reform, but for spiritual redemption. Now, if the God of the Bible did intend for social reform to take place through human history, which I think is true, if spiritual redemption is the priority, like I said, but social reform was also part of the plan, I think the way in which Christianity changed culture synchronizes perfectly with how ideas actually develop over time. And how does it do that? By accomplishing its main goal first. Changing a society by first changing the hearts of the individuals that make up the society. In this case, social reform may be a side effect, right? It can be evidence of the changed hearts of the people that make up a society, yet the heart itself is still what Christianity claims God is actually interested in. Let's look at 1 Samuel 16:7. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Here we can clearly see the Bible describes that our actions flow downstream of our heart's condition. Reforming behavior without changing the heart is just superficial. The Bible doesn't begin with social reform because social reform doesn't solve the human problem. Slavery is a great example of that. As the evidence we just went over shows, it was not a social or cultural problem, but a human one. So instead, the Bible begins with the heart. Change the heart, and culture eventually follows. Skip the heart, and injustice probably just reappears somewhere else down the line. Again, just using slavery as an example, but let's stay on it. What does Jesus have to say about it? In John chapter 8, Jesus is talking to his disciples. He tells them, if you abide in my word, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So the disciples ask Jesus, why do you say we'll be set free when we've never been slaves? So just by the way the disciples respond, we know obviously they understood that when Jesus said set free, at least they took it in a context related to slavery. So now how does Jesus respond to them? John chapter 8, verse 34, Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Even here, when Jesus does make a comment about the problem of slavery, he acknowledges it as a spiritual problem. Okay, maybe you're following me so far. Perhaps this kind of makes sense, hopefully. But you may still be asking, if the Bible does provide moral laws, which it does, why not just give a law that says no slavery, right? Well, that's a fair question. I think it's a common question. if we look at the Bible, it tells us clearly that the moral law it provides exists solely to expose the heart, not perfect society. It's made very clear the law is not capable of setting things right. If there was a law in the Bible that said no more wars, do you think it would stop all the wars? There is a law that says no murder. Has it ever stopped murder? There's a law that says no adultery. Do you think it's ever stopped adultery? Has the law ever kept a human from stealing or lying? All of these things have prevailed throughout all humanity, including by the Christians. It's logical to conclude then that if God gave a law of no more slavery, that wouldn't fix the problem of what was going on in the human heart that brought about slavery in the first place. Let's look at Romans 3:20. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Just the knowledge of it, right? Not the betterment of society, but the awareness of the problems. The law's purpose, as stated here, is to diagnose, not to cure, to reveal moral failure rather than fixing it. We can see Jesus expanding on this repeatedly throughout his ministry, as he was always reframing our concept of morality as a heart issue rather than just our external actions. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother has already murdered him in his heart." He goes on to give another example. He says, "Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Here, two examples. Jesus is not belittling the laws of morality, but in fact intensifying them. He's revealing the way in which moral laws properly identify the source of evil actions. Evil is rooted internally before it manifests externally or socially. Matthew 23, starting in verse 25, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but the inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, so that the outside also may be clean." Now, I've gone into this in depth in another video on Patreon, but this is another example of how Jesus explicitly condemns law-keeping without inward transformation. Basically saying time and time again, even if you do everything right on the outside, but you have not addressed the problems in your heart, you've completely missed the point. None of this, of course, is a justification for any wrongdoing by Christians. I'm just walking through these examples to emphasize that Christianity, or the Bible specifically, is a spiritual text meant for an individual's spiritual transformation, not cultural revolution. The heart is what God has always been concerned with from the very beginning. This brings me to this person's second comment about Cain and Abel and the clear misunderstanding I think this person has about what this story means. Let's look at the comment again. The starting point of Cain's anger/sin comes from his offerings being seen as less. His offerings, or put differently, him being seen as less. His life's work, his effort as a human being seen as less valuable than Abel's, his offering, and therefore his soul being rejected. So my interpretation in the context would be Cain's sin originates from being seen as worth less by God. So I would put the fault of killing Abel, at least partly, in God's hand for putting different worth in the two brothers. Okay, I don't want to make this response exhaustive, so let me try and be precise. Your comment says Cain's sin originates from being seen as worth less by God, but the story clearly points to Cain's sin originating from the heart, and I'm going to show you that in a second. You interpreted that the reason God saw him as less is because God decided his life's work was worth less, or that he just was. If we actually look at the text of the story, God makes the reason he rejected Cain's offering very clear. And big surprise, it's the condition of Cain's heart when giving the offering, not the offering itself. Not Cain as a person, and certainly not Cain's life's work. On top of that, God did not let Cain be confused about this. He did not let Cain think it was a rejection of his life's work, which then led to the killing of Abel. Instead, you're missing the part of the story directly in between the offerings and the killing, where God tells Cain and us exactly what he's concerned with, not our work, but our hearts. Let's look at Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought to the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Now here's where it is. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, and you must rule over it." God says nothing about the type of offering Cain gave, and he says nothing to suggest Cain is arbitrarily seen as worth less than his brother. Instead, God encourages Cain not to be upset, but that he must do well in his heart to rule over sin. I hope that's clear, but just so that there's not any confusion, so you don't think I'm just interpreting it my way, maybe God is saying do well, and you're thinking that he's saying do well in terms of his life's work. Let's look at Jeremiah 17:10. I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. God did respond to Cain's actions. He literally responded to the fruit of his deeds, but he judged them based on searching his heart. I think the possible reason why you took this story to be about outward action and completely missed the part of the heart is 1 Samuel 16:7. Again, God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Likewise, if the Bible is the Word of God, you have to look at it not as man sees it, but as God would from the context of the heart. I hope that clears that story up for you if you're watching. Hope you are. And maybe anyone else who didn't quite understand that before. Okay, so we've laid out this idea. We're almost through it, guys. All right, stay with me. All right, I hope everyone's having fun. Okay, we've laid out this idea very, very thoroughly that Christianity is a matter of the heart. I hope everyone has that. Now, like I said before, you could still critique Christians even if everything I just laid out is true. But let's say you still wanted to give a critique about them socially or culturally. Let's say we agree that it was Christian theology that grounded the arguments to abolish slavery in the West, which I think is pretty historically agreed upon. Perhaps we also acknowledge some other philosophical groundwork they laid that helped advance society's modern views on human equality. Even if I've made a strong enough case to convince you on that, maybe I haven't, but if I have, I think you can still ask, why did it take so long for Christians to change? And before they did change, why did they do so much evil? Not just slavery, but whatever evil or injustice you want to point out. This makes me think of the other comment I received accusing me of being a Christian supremacist sounding like a Christian supremacist because I attributed some specific good in our society to Christianity. The comment went on to point out that there's a lot of bad things Christians have done. I don't disagree about that. Christian supremacist is obviously a very loaded term, but it's an interesting one. It's true that I believe Christ is the ultimate good, the highest, the top, right? If you want to call that supremacy, I'd say go ahead. But there's an important distinction to make about what I believe, a distinction I think this commenter was missing, not about what Christ is, but what it means to be a Christian. which oddly enough is the exact opposite of supremacy. To be a Christian is a very unique walk of faith, where from the very beginning of that walk is a recognition not of how good you are or supreme you are, but how lowly you are, not of pride, but of humility. James 4:6, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He opposes the proud. 1 Corinthians starting in verse 26, for consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast. Now, even if you wanted to be the best Christian you could possibly be, let's say you're inside Christianity now, you're running around, you're doing what you can, and because you always like to do the very best you can, you're still forming naturally, right? Well-intentioned, but you're still forming some sort of supremacist ideas. You're thinking, okay, if as Christians, we're all in agreement that we're at the bottom, what if I want to be at the top of the bottom? Well, I'd say that's great. You're in luck, because Jesus actually addresses this and tells you exactly how to do it. Let's look at Mark 9:35. It reads, sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, the 12 are his 12 disciples. Jesus called the 12 and said, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. Not only is the life of a Christian the antithesis of supremacy, yes, we put God in a place of supremacy, but for us as Christians, even if we want to be the very best Christian we can be, Jesus clearly says the only way to do that is to take our place at the bottom. Now, I think any critique of the evil committed by Christians is totally fair. It's valid. I would go as far as saying all Christians throughout history have been moral failures. So am I. But the Bible doesn't contradict this. Instead, time and time again, it reveals a clear picture of it. My favorite illustration is in one of its oldest stories. I'll give you guys a quick version of it. Throughout the Old Testament, we get the history of an ancient nation, the Israelites. God calls them his chosen people. Everyone's probably heard that before, but I think sometimes it can be confusing as to what that means. See, they weren't chosen because they were better than everyone else. They weren't even chosen to become better than everyone else. They were chosen for a task, to be an example for the rest of the world of what it means to follow God. While that example, this nation may have literally played itself out in real life, on earth, through long stretches of time, the story of the nation was also written down so that we can see clearly what God was trying to reveal to the rest of the world. Let me show you an example that relates to our discussion. The people were called Israelites, as they were all descendants of a man named Israel. This man, Israel, had 12 sons. It says the father showed special favor for one of the sons, but then his brothers, out of envy, sold that favored son as a slave into Egypt. So there we go. Right away, there's a bit of slavery in an ancient story, this time caused by jealousy. There's definitely a bigger message behind this part of the story, but let's just skip ahead. After a number of interesting events, the whole family, the father, Israel, and the brothers united in Egypt. Here is where they end up settling, and that one family grows into an entire ethnic group over the next 400 plus years. Now we have to remember, in this story, everything that happens with this group of people contains a message for us. It was recorded to reveal to us either something about God, something about us, our hearts, and about what it means to be alive here on earth today. As the story goes, the Israelites grew as a people enslaved by Egypt. Now try to follow me on this. This is God's chosen people, and he allowed them to grow into a nation from the very beginning, from one family over 400 plus years by living and dying through generations of slavery. A chosen people born into slavery. In this story, Egypt represents our broken world. The Israelites, who are called God's firstborn, represent a child of God. And just like us today, if we call ourselves a child of God, we are born into this broken world as slaves to sin. Now, the next part of this story is important. The next character we meet is Moses. God uses him to call his chosen people out of Egypt and offers to take them to a promised land filled with milk and honey. So God calls them out of Egypt, but they don't leave right away. In some ways, the people are unsure. They don't know what to think about this guy, Moses, who's delivering the message to them. And in their attempts to leave Egypt, there's also a struggle as Egypt fights to keep them where they are. But eventually, they escape. Yet instead of being delivered from Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey, they find themselves crossing a barren desert to get there. Just like us today, born in the world, slaves to sin, God calls us out of the world and tells us to follow him to the promised land. For some, it can be a struggle to leave the world behind. Some people don't believe in what they're being offered. Some do believe, but still choose not to answer the call. But even if you do choose to follow God and step out of a spiritual Egypt, you quickly realize you're only entering a spiritual wilderness that you still have to cross. The wilderness journey representing the life of faith. Now, the next part of the story directly pertains to our discussion. What happened to the Israelites on this wilderness journey? It's a long story with a lot to learn throughout it, but I'll try to sum it up. From the moment they left Egypt, even though they had just witnessed many miracles and wonders performed by God, still, they began to complain, they began to doubt. Many of them wanted to go back to Egypt, and over time, this chosen people committed just about every evil act they could and turned against God almost every time things didn't go the way they wanted. The distance, it says, that they would have had to travel across the desert to the promised land could have taken them about 11 days on foot. Instead, it says, because of their sin, because of their moral failures, they wandered lost in the desert for 40 years. Now, you can apply this story to the individual. As I just said, it can represent the life of a Christian, but I think it also applies, or can also apply, to Christians as a whole. If we think of all Christians as a people group, you can see we're told right here at the very beginning of the Bible what the nature of humans are, even the nature of people who choose to follow God. Perhaps the reason God's word took so long to effect change in our society is the same reason it took the Israelites 40 years to cross a distance of 11 days. The reason is the human heart, which can be filled with wickedness even if you're called a child of God. Let's go back to the claim I made in my last video, the one that's drawn a little bit of pushback about the good provided to the world by Christianity. Even if we think of all the innovations we walked through in this video, all the cultural contributions to society that I think most people would consider good, the important distinction I want to make is that I don't believe this good comes from Christians. We believe nothing good comes from us. Rather, good is provided to the world by God through his word. And if that word's going to have any effect on society, the good has to flow upstream through history, fighting against the violent current of human hearts. When I look at how long Christian ideas took to affect society, all I see is evidence of how wicked the human heart is. And to me, this is not a point against Christianity, but further proof of its claims. Let's read John 3:19-20. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. All right. That about wraps it up. I think I'm going to read one more and then we'll close out. I don't want to end on such a dark note, so I think we should read something maybe encouraging or a little instructive. Also, I received a number of other responses on the last video. Like I said, I did respond to them in the comments on Patreon, but it'd be nice to maybe do a video about that. And I know that I might get some more pushback to this video, so maybe a video about that. Also, I did not forget about this person's question about following religion being a weakness. I really do want to get to that. I have something to say. I think just for the sake of time, we should also save that for another one. And it might distract from the overarching point we've gone over in this one. Okay. Yes. I love you all. Thanks for being here. Let's read a bit of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and we'll end it out. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it.